This is part 3 in our 3-part series about migration within the United States. Not how people got here, but how and why they moved around and where they moved to. In part 1, we saw the government of the United States take away the lands that the Native Americans had been living on for thousands of years and just give it to the local settlers. We traced the movement from east to west and the history of the gold rush. In part 2, we looked at the movement of people from farms to cities, the effect of the world wars, the great migration of African Americans out of the South, and the Dust Bowl migration. Once again, Stuart Schoen will be joining me and sharing his knowledge and insight to migration in the United States. In this program, we'll examine the idea of migrations of convenience, moving to the suburbs, industries and workers moving to the Sunbelt, tech industries and workers moving back into the gentrified, consumer-driven cities. But first, we need to find a place to hang out. Once again, we are based in Phoenix, Arizona. In terms of architecture, Phoenix has a rather special history. Frank Lloyd Wright was one of the great architects of the 20th century. Much of his practice was centered in the Chicago area, and like so many people from the frozen north, as he got older, the winter weather became more and more annoying. So in 1929, at the age of 62, he moved to Phoenix and settled into the Sonora Desert. Many of the important buildings he designed in Phoenix were built in other cities, like the Guggenheim Museum in New York. But he also did some outstanding work that was built right here. This is the Harold Price House. I know this program is about migration, but when we started talking about the move to the suburbs and we ended up in this Frank Lloyd Wright house, I thought I owed it to you to show you the whole place in detail. It's an amazing house, and I want to apologize for this digression. Right after we see the house, we'll get back to the migration.
This is a really unique house. He was thinking, one, how to have Grandma and Grandpa live harmoniously with these grandchildren. So you've got this interconnectivity within the bedrooms. Each bedroom sort of is open to the other through various large and small doorways and openings. But there's also a universal desire in Frank Lloyd Wright's work to be harmonious with the site as well. So you've got concrete block and copper that's put together in a way that's reminiscent of not only the mountainside that we're sited upon, but some of the desert plants as well. So these columns that are growing a half inch with every course, sort of an inverted pyramid, but what it ends up being reminiscent of is, I think, the ocotillo, which is a cactus here that grows in that same form. So a lot of the desert textures and shapes are played out here in the house. In the atrium space of the house, what we would call the atrium, it's really drawn on the original plans as the outdoor living room. But it's this wonderful indoor-outdoor space where you are fully outdoors but sheltered. And you've got the pairing of the elements here, air, light, water, and fire. So this great 8-foot skylight, this 8-foot collecting pool, sort of reminiscent of like a Roman fluvium house. And then this monstrous 10-foot hearth fireplace. With the exception of the appliances, the kitchen is entirely original. The stainless steel counters, the task lighting, all of these things that look really contemporary are entirely original to 1955. So really functional, forward-thinking. Stainless steel was being used on the F-86 Sabre in 1955. These are fighter plane materials being put to use here in the kitchen. Also, these great little seats that swing out. There's one on that side as well as 2 on this side of the island. So you've got places for the grandkids to sit while grandma is cooking, being that this is the grandma house. But also, if you're grandma and you're working on a big meal, this is a great way to relax at your prep surface. So what else is really unique about the house is the turquoise palette here that you can see in the living room. Frank Lloyd Wright is typically working in red, yellow, orange, these autumnal colors. And here the site was going to be the darker of our orange pillows. It's pyracantha orange, after the pyracantha berry. And Frank Lloyd Wright is on site, inspecting how the work is going, He's walking around. It's wintertime. He's got this big coat on, and he's walking around with Charles Montooth, that was really in charge of the day-to-day work here. And he says, "Hang on, Charles, hold on." He's got something that's bugging him, banging around in his pocket. So he stops and he pulls out this big turquoise ring. So his wife, Olga Ivana, had somehow, or he had somehow gotten this ring into his coat. And he pulls it out and he's looking at it with Charles. He goes, "Charles, come here." And he grabs Charles and they start looking at the house like this, with the ring in front of them. And he ends up leaving this turquoise ring with Charles. He goes, "Here, I want you to make the house turquoise." And so that's sort of vague, but over the next 8 or so months of construction, through review, they end up settling on the turquoise palette for all of the furniture, as well as for the steel work. So our overhead structure, this is a real departure. I mean, Frank Lloyd Wright, almost universally throughout his career, steel is Cherokee red. That is the color of steel to Frank Lloyd Wright. So here at age 87, he's taking this leap, a real departure from even his own sort of edicts, and selecting turquoise, saying that it was cooling, calming, and appropriately southwestern.
After considerable discussion as to the architectural merits of the various areas in the house, we decided to settle into the kitchen. First up, the migration from city to suburb. Draw a circle around the city. Now draw a second, bigger circle around the first circle. When you move from the inner circle that marks the city to the outer circle, you have moved from the city to the suburbs. The idea of moving from the city to an area just outside the city goes back to before the American Revolution. As a matter of fact, developers were promoting suburban areas just outside New York and Boston during the 1800s. And the idea of using the word suburban actually goes back to the 1800s.
So at the end of World War II, movement to the suburbs really became a major migration. And when that happened, the suburbs set up their own school systems, their own shopping centers. Barbecue techniques became disseminated, and the art of the Tupperware party became a thing.
I was born on a small island just off the coast of the United States called Manhattan. And I grew up on that island and a small piece of the mainland called the Bronx.
In our United States, about half of the people live in cities and their suburbs.
Our house in the Bronx was directly across the street from Yankee Stadium. And my father had a cleaning store just down the block. He did the cleaning for the Yankee uniforms. And I got to deliver them to the stadium and stay for the game. I once got a $1 tip from Mickey Mantle. And years later, when I was interviewing him for CNN, he remembered my weekly deliveries to his place in the Concord Plaza Hotel.
This is Manhattan, business center of New York City and heart of the city's life.
I was a city kid, and I lived in a neighborhood that was typical of American cities of the time. Lots of different ethnic groups, one right next to the other.
Some of the people who work in Manhattan live in apartment houses and other sections of the city.
My building had families that immigrated to the United States from Italy, Sicily, Ireland, Germany, Austria, Russia, Poland, and Ukraine. And then there was the second floor. The local stores were spread out through the neighborhood. There was no distinct shopping area. The building next to the one I lived in had a delicatessen. Next to that was what was technically known as a beauty parlor. Then came my father's cleaning store, and at the corner, the Yankee Tavern. Everything right next to everything else was a central aspect of American cities in the years before the move to the suburbs. Kenneth Jackson is the author of what many scholars consider to be the definitive work on the subject. It's called Crabgrass Frontier, the Suburbanization of the United States. He called neighborhoods like mine walking cities. Everything was tight and small, and most people worked near where they lived. The great move to the suburbs came at the end of World War II. In 1945 and 1946, millions of servicemen returned to the United States, and the federal government had passed a series of laws designing to improve the life of the returning veterans. The GI Bill offered educational benefits, and within a few years, thousands of veterans earned their university degrees, creating a new and well-educated middle class.
Men, coming back here to school has meant a lot to me. Frankly, I couldn't afford it if it wasn't for the GI Bill of Rights. Everyone's been very friendly and cooperative, and you can rest assured when you come back to school, you'll receive the same friendly cooperation that I have.
Others went to vocational schools that improved their skill levels and made it easier for them to earn a better living. The Veterans Administration and the Federal Housing Administration were dedicated to helping veterans get housing. At the same time, there was enormous interest in shopping. It had been over 15 years since the American shopper was important.
Without jobs, we had no money. And without money, we could not purchase food for the hungry mouths at home.
Starting with the Great Depression in 1929 and running through the end of World War II, there wasn't much available to the average consumer.
Buying a new car during the war was terribly difficult because all of our automobile factories were not producing cars, they were producing machinery necessary for the war effort. And even if you owned a car already, it was very difficult to simply own one due to all of the gasoline rationing that the country was doing.
Levittown houses are not prefabricated.
Enter the Levitt brothers, William and Alfred. William was the salesman, and Alfred was the architect.
The idea that came to a man named Bill Levitt was this: why not apply to the building of houses the same principles that have brought other American industries to their unexcelled peaks of efficiency and service? Why not mass produce the elements that go to make up a house, just as the auto industry does with the parts that go into a new car?
Their idea was to use mass production techniques to build houses on a plot of land they bought in Hempstead, Long Island, about 30 miles from New York City. Straightforward, uncomplicated homes on lots that were 100 feet by 60 feet. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a small backyard for the barbecue, and little grass for the newly arrived baby boomers. They built 17,000 homes that housed over 80,000 people. They built schools and swimming pools and churches.
In addition, there are other facilities designed to draw residents together to help make them feel they are part of a real community. Recreation centers with provisions for filling leisure hours, summer or winter.
They even gave you a television set as a gift when you moved in. Of course, there was almost nothing on television at the time, but it was the thought that counted. When the Levitt houses first went on sale, people stood on lines to place their orders. The brothers got the point and began building additional Levittowns in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. It was a good time to be a land developer in the suburbs. Other Levittown-like developments were built outside cities throughout the United States. By 1960, 1/3 of the nation's population lived in suburban areas. We also saw the development of what we call strip cities, a suburb so close to the next suburb that you ended up with one long strip of suburbs connecting one city to the next. Boston to New York, New York to Washington, D.C., Cleveland to Pittsburgh, Chicago to Milwaukee.
Most people who lived in communities like Levittown thought they were great. There was space, light, a lawn. You could hang out and get to know your neighbors. However, it is important to remember that none of those neighbors would be African Americans. Until the 1960s, Levittown excluded African Americans.
I had an aunt who lived in a Levittown-like development, and she was very serious about what she called her bridge club. One day I asked her, "What do you all do at the bridge club?" And this is what she said.
We are a group of women deeply interested in our country's infrastructure and responsible for much of the work on the Verrazano Bridge.
To a great extent, the suburbs symbolized the optimism of the time. We also began buying cars again. There had not been a new model out of Detroit since 1942.
You will be amazed to find so many very fine late model cars offered at such low prices and on such easy terms. We have the car that will make a hit with the whole family.
With men saving their military pay and many women working in the defense industry and putting aside their money, there was a sizable national bankroll. Americans began buying cars again. Between 1945 and 1949, we bought 10 million cars. In some cases, families bought 2 cars, one for the commute to work and one to drive around suburbia, which consisted mostly of shopping for household essentials and bringing the kids to and from school.
If you want to enjoy life in a beautiful late model car, bring your husband to our used car lot.
The suburbs attracted a lot of industrial and commercial activity. At the same time, they shifted political influence away from the cities. The millions of people who made the move from city to suburbs experienced many of the same challenges that were faced at an earlier time by people who were moving to the cities. In both instances, newcomers had to deal with unfamiliar institutions, people, cultural patterns, and as a result, both cities and suburbs became centers of historical change. But like everything else, living in the suburbs wasn't perfect. You live very close to your neighbors, so everyone knew what was going on inside of everyone else's house, and everyone discussed what was going on inside of everyone else's house.
In spite of the 10 Commandments, there was a lot of coveting going on. Husbands coveted other men's wives. Wives coveted other men's husbands. Cars were coveted. Furniture was coveted. Even barbecue grills were coveted.
In many cases, moving to the suburbs meant that you lost contact with the rest of your family. And that was not always a bad thing, of course. But, it invariably had to have a negative impact on the family.
I stayed in the city, and my grandmother lived just down the block. And I'd see her once a day, and sometimes twice a day. My cousins lived in the suburbs, and they were lucky to see her once a month. And that was sad. She was a great storyteller, a fabulous cook, and she offered unconditional love. The Sunbelt consists of the southern part of the United States, stretching from the southeast to the southwest. Basically, it's the third of the country below the 36th parallel. It offers its residents a warm climate with long, sometimes very hot summers and short, mild winters.
Construction of this aircraft was well underway when the year 1955 began.
Starting in the 1950s, companies in the aerospace and defense industries started moving to the area. During the Second World War, a number of major military bases had been set up in the western part of the Sunbelt. It made sense to have your manufacturing facility near your customers.
But then the company moved in and set up this refinery. That gave new life to the town, new jobs.
Texas and Louisiana benefited from the oil and natural gas industries. These days, Texas and California rank among the top 5 states in the country with the most Fortune 500 companies.
Vacationers come from near and far to enjoy the sun.
And tourism became a big business in Florida and Southern California.
With thousands of motel and hotel rooms, there are accommodations to fit every vacation budget.
Here in Arizona, we've had a very high influx of high-tech companies, agricultural companies, tourists, of course, and a great many people came here to Arizona to retire from some of these really cold areas of our country.
Moving companies spot trends first.
Every year, we help thousands and thousands of people move. Sometimes that's all the way across the country, sometimes that's just across town. But we offer rental equipment, we offer storage, so we know how these trips start off. We know where they end, and in many cases, we know why the trips happen in the first place. So I think that over the course of decades of doing this, we've learned a lot about how America moves.
Our research indicates that between 2000 and 2030, almost 90% of the growth in our nation's population will take place in the Sunbelt. Florida, Texas, and California will each add about 12 million people. Nevada, Arizona, Florida, and Texas are expected to be the fastest growing states. In 2012 and 2013, many people became cautious about moving. However, in 2015, migration to the Sunbelt picked up again. Suddenly, the South became extremely attractive, more attractive than the West, and people began moving there. For the first time in the state's history, I think it was 1988, more people left California than moved into it, and they were moving to the South. In the late 70s, we began using the term gentrification in the U.S. There was a distinction between gentrification and urban redevelopment. Urban redevelopment was used to describe the large-scale demolition of slum areas, the erection of new buildings, and the use of government subsidies. Gentrification, in contrast, involved the gradual and private rehabilitation of the existing structures. Urban development referred to something organized by the government or a large redevelopment company. They had a plan, usually not a very good plan, but nevertheless a plan. Gentrification was something somebody wanted to do on their own, and they did whatever they wanted to do. I think of gentrification as a phrase describing what I used to be able to afford, but no longer can. I grew up in a traditional older neighborhood in New York City, and then moved to an area that was in the process of being gentrified. Many of the people who were moving in at the time I was moving were involved in the arts. Writers, painters, musicians. Of course, they were also forcing out the poorer people who had been living in that neighborhood for generations. But that little nicety was lost on the government and the development companies who were undertaking the task. The new middle-class arrivals were attracted to the inner city areas because the housing was not very expensive. The architecture connected them to the past, which was considered to represent a higher level of aesthetics, and the communities offered easy access to the business districts. I bought an apartment on West 67th Street, just off Central Park. It had been built in 1917 and was in its original condition, which is a way of politely saying it was a disaster. Eventually, I ended up with a great apartment in a building that was considered a structure of historic importance. During a visit to my old neighborhood, I was struck by a new form of gentrification, which has been labeled the global or super gentrification stage. An international investment firm buys a nice old property, tears it down, and puts up a building designed to hold money rather than people. They are extraordinarily tasteless high-rise structures owned by foreign companies, and most of the apartments are uninhabited. They are called zombie buildings, which I think is a perfect description. And on that terrifying note, we conclude our 3 programs on migration within the United States. I hope you've enjoyed them, and I hope you will join us next time. For Travels and Traditions, I'm Burt Wolf. But wait, there's more. Whenever we edit one of our programs, we always end up with more good material than we can fit in. Interviews, stories, recipes. So we decided to put them on our website, burtwolf.com.